Hello again. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about a tactic that is sometimes used when you're speaking with an elder in the Kingdom Hall or even in private, sometimes in a judicial setting or where there's counsel being given. If somebody were to express confusion or doubts, perhaps, about a variety of topics, at some point the elder will switch gears from trying to um, defend or explain a position that's supported by the organization. And what they'll do is they'll sidestep it just slightly. And they'll take the tactic of saying, well, let's go back to basics. And then they'll go down this litany of basic concepts that, as a witness, you probably would very easily agree with. So they would say, do you believe that the Bible, or do you accept that the Bible is God's Word? If you say yes, okay. Do you believe that Jehovah is God? That Jehovah is God's name? If you say yes to that, do you believe that Jesus is his son? If you say yes to that, do you believe that he came to earth to die in behalf of mankind's sins? If you say yes to that, they will continue on and get you in a yes frame of mind. So you're consistently saying yes, yes. There have been people that I've talked to that have been on the receiving end of this line of reasoning that feel that it's a little patronizing because they had a specific question. They had a question that maybe there's been a recent change in teaching or belief. Actually, I'm going to come back around to that, the difference between teaching or belief. But at any rate, there was a legitimate question that somebody had, and they go to their shepherd, they go to their teacher, they go to their elder to try to get some additional explanation or defense of a position. And then they're faced with this going all the way back to square one. Do you believe the Bible? Do you believe Jehovah? Do you believe Jesus? And one of the questions that's typically asked is, do you believe that the organization known as Jehovah's Witnesses is the representation of God's organization visibly? That God has an invisible organization made up of loyal spirit creatures, and that the manifestation of his visible organization is what we can see on earth. And specifically, it's an organization that's identified as being Jehovah's Witnesses. So perhaps some of you watching this video know what I'm talking about. You might have experienced firsthand that type of conversation with an elder. There's a couple terms that you've probably heard if you've been a witness for any length of time. There's a couple terms that they use, and they're almost interchangeable. One of which is you could go to Watchtower Online Library, you could go to your own personal library, and you can search the title or the topic, pattern of thinking. That's a term that's kind of specific to the organization. When you take a look at pattern of thinking, and sometimes you'll hear the term being used, inculcate. Information is inculcated into Jehovah's servants, or a parent might inculcate the truth of the Bible into the minds of their child. So when you take a look at the definitions of some of these terms, they're on the surface, based on the context of a belief system, it might seem reasonable to use some of these terms, but when you give a little bit additional thought on some of these terms, they all of a sudden sound a little bit more insidious. So as an example, that term inculcate. Inculcate is to instill something by persistent instruction. So if you were to learn something by rote, for an example, so when you're in the early grade school levels, you might have had the multiplication tables inculcated because your assignment, your homework when you go home is to study, 3 times 3 is 9, 3 times 4 is 12, 3 times 5 is 15, and to do it repetitively over and over and over again gets a basic understanding of the multiplication tables, and we've all experienced that. But some of the synonyms for that word inculcate also have to do with teaching an attitude, not just facts, but also a prevailing attitude or a pattern of thinking. Some of the synonyms are instill, indoctrinate, drill, plant, hammer into, to use the vernacular, and in some cases even brainwash. Now I know that that is a very loaded term to use that, so let me pull that one back. Let me pull that off of the table. But if you've been raised within a family that is believing Jehovah's Witnesses, these terms are used very casually. Information will be inculcated. You have a pattern of thinking. But when you contrast that with what a belief is, going back to what the elders will sometimes do as well, do you believe Jehovah? Do you believe the Bible? Do you believe the organization? Things like that. That whole concept is simply an operating system that's being planted into you, that's being drilled into you, that's being hammered into you, where you're not necessarily saying this thought is in harmony with what I believe, but rather I'm going to now parrot back things that somebody told me to believe. Because when you look at the definition of a belief, it's something that's accepted by yourself to be a true opinion, something that's believed. You can put confidence in a person, or you can put confidence in a concept, or you can put confidence in a thing, because it's something that you own a belief. A belief is something that belongs to you. So if we go back in time a little bit, think about some of the beliefs. If you were to ask a witness, let's go back to the early 90s or the mid 90s. If you were to ask any given witness at your local congregation or Kingdom Hall or assembly or convention, as the case might be, and you were to ask them, do you believe that the generation that saw the start of 1914 and were old enough to recognize what that was and the significance of that year, do you believe that that generation will by no means pass off the earthly scene until all of the things promised in the Bible would be fulfilled? Do you believe that? And I think unhesitatingly, any witness that you were to approach back 25 years ago, 22 years ago, for example, in the mid-90s, that they would say, yes, I believe that. And then in 1995, all of a sudden, you wouldn't necessarily get such an immediate knee-jerk, yes, I believe that, because that's when that teaching started to evolve, to change into something else. So if you believed that the generation that saw 1914 would by no means pass off the earthly scene until the fulfillment of all the things that the Bible speaks about, that would not be something that would be an easy concept for you to just dismiss. So therefore, was that ever actually a belief? Or was that a teaching? Was it something that was instilled in you? Was it something that was inculcated in you? Because if it was something that was planted or just simply drilled into your head or into your mind, when that teaching no longer becomes convenient, it now is a couple degrees off. So now all of a sudden, well, the generation could mean more than one thing. Whereas just a couple years earlier, every witness would have responded in lockstep fashion, saying, no, there's no overlapping about it. The generation specifically would not pass away. And that's reflected by the publications of the time. So for an example, when you look back to the Knowledge Book, you look back to the Live Forever book, it's stated not as a concept, not as an idea, but rather an absolute truth from God that the generation would by no means pass away. So let's move it a little bit into a different territory. Let's now take the belief, if you will, of the identity of the faithful and discreet slave, which is another concept that is routinely taught as a belief of Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you were to go back and talk to a witness from the early to mid-90s, all the way through probably till about 2013 or so, and you were to ask, well, what is the identity of the faithful and discreet slave? I think most witnesses of that time frame would say that the identity of the faithful and discreet slave is the remaining members of the anointed remnant that are still on earth at any given time. That all of those as a group make up the identity of the faithful and discreet slave. And there were faithful witnesses by the thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, that went to their grave believing that that was the identity of the faithful and discreet slave. Now, all of a sudden, in 2013, that teaching, it's not a belief, it's a teaching. In other words, you're being told what to believe. You're being told what opinion you can have confidence in. Now, all of a sudden, that's changed. So now, the faithful and discreet slave, if you're a loyal witness, is going to now be identified, oh, I absolutely believe that it is the governing body. Not the individuals that make up the governing body, but when the governing body specifically is operating as a group, as the governing body, that specifically is the identity of the faithful and discreet slave. If you were to ask a witness a variety of other teachings that they have, for an example, over the course of time, there have been a variety of, again, teachings, not beliefs. A belief and a teaching are two separate things. If you believe something, just because somebody changes the way that it's being presented sometime in the future, if it was a belief, it would not be something that would be easy to change. If it was a teaching, it's much, much easier to change your opinion on a teaching because it's not something it doesn't belong to you. Somebody is spoon-feeding that information to you. So that whole concept of a teaching and a belief, they're not interchangeable things. So when I talk to people who have been witnesses, specifically those that have been witnesses for a longer period of time and have seen the progression or the change, it's always written off to being new light. But the idea here is that it's not really a belief if it's something that changes. Oh, now I interpret that to be something completely different than how I used to. So if you take a look at the identity of, let's say, just to throw out a couple topics off the top of my head, the identity of who is Babylon the Great, for an example. Of course, most witnesses would be able to rattle off the definition that has been given them for years or decades. Oh, Babylon the Great is the world empire false religion. Okay. So what is the identity of the prophetic harlot that rides on the scarlet-colored wild beast? What is the identity of the scarlet-colored wild beast? What is the identity of this creature or this image that is portrayed in Bible in Bible verse, for example, in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation? What are the identities nowadays of those beasts? So if it was something that you believed, you could simply explain what that belief is because it's something that belongs to you. But if you're kind of rusty on what a belief is, what you do is you go to the publications, you go to the website, and you find out what the current teaching is on the identity of any of those different characters that I just mentioned. So therefore, it's not a belief, it's a teaching. Teachings change. Beliefs are much more difficult to change. So over the course of the last year or so, I've had the opportunity to have a couple of videos that I recorded at JW Literature Carts. And my reason for having some of these topics is just to engage in a conversation to find out the beliefs that are stated on jw.org are stated as teachings, not beliefs. A Jehovah's Witness might believe, for an example, that God's name is Jehovah. They might believe that the organization known as the Watchtower Bible and Tracts Society, is the visible representation of God's organization on earth. They might believe that Jesus did not die on a cross. They might believe that a blood transfusion is the same thing as eating blood, as warned against in the Bible. But let's take that blood transfusion thing for an example. There was a time that belief was not parsed. Any form of taking blood into somebody's body, into your body, would be wrong. So the current teaching, according to the organization, is now parsed it down to, well, you wouldn't want to take any of the four main components of blood. Where's the scripture that says that? It's the interpretation, it's the teaching that's being inculcated into witnesses today that is saying that's where the limitation is. There was a time that a belief of a witness would be that it would be wrong to have an organ transplant because that is something that I believe would be akin to cannibalism. Has that witness's belief changed over the years, or is simply the teaching that's offered by the organization changed? When that teaching changes, all of a sudden, however many hundreds of thousands or millions of witnesses around the world are expected to now believe that. If you have a belief, whatever those beliefs are, it's your prerogative to have those beliefs. If you feel compelled as a result of those beliefs to stand out at a literature cart or knock on the doors of your neighbors, and you want to have an interchange and an explanation, or a conversation, I should say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it, and offer biblical proof if you want, or historical proof. I completely respect the fact that a person could have a variety of different beliefs. But when somebody offers a little bit of respectful pushback and saying, well, could you help me understand why you believe it? If the whole basis of your response goes back to, well, why don't you look at this website? Why don't you look at this publication? And whatever that publication says, whatever the answer is officially in print, therefore that is my belief. I put to you that that is not a belief, but rather it's something that you've just been indoctrinated in. So over the course of time, just sharing my own personal story, there were things that I thought I believed. And over the course of time, I realized that I wasn't being shown the whole truth. That the proofs that were offered in defense of these beliefs were just simply teachings. Teachings change. Teachings adjust. Teachings do not stand the test of time because the body of knowledge that we have continues to change and be added to and to grow. So there were things that I believed when I was a young boy. There were things that I believed when I was in high school. There were things that I believed when I was pioneering back in the late 80s into the early to mid 90s. There were things that I thought that I believed that if I was a witness now, those would no longer be part of my beliefs because the teachings of the organization have changed. So personally, I found that once I started researching things and once I started finding out that, the position that was put forth officially didn't really have as much backing in science and secular history and language and things like that. It didn't have the type of, it wasn't a bona fide position. So that got me to thinking, well, if this one particular topic that I looked into and found that the explanation was wanting, well, what about all these other things that I felt I believed? So therefore, it wasn't something personally that took me like flipping a switch, that all of a sudden I instantly just dropped things that I had thought I believed for years or decades. It was a long process. I had to really ask myself continually, well, what is it that you believe, and why do you believe it? So as an exercise, that's something that might take months. It might take years. There are things that I feel much more comfortable with today in being able to explain and to be able to offer personally from my own heart, from my own information that I've gathered. There are things that I can explain a lot better now than I ever could when I was a witness. And I will be the first one to agree that based on more accurate information or based on further study, that the things that I hold to be true today might continue to adjust. But one thing that I really want to work hard at doing is fighting that impulse where somebody is asking me to defend a position that I have, and they're asking me, what do you believe? I don't want to just go to a book. I don't want to go to an organization. I don't want to go to a publication or a website to look up what I believe. If I can't explain a thought that I have, or if I can't explain a position that I hold true or hold dear, it's not a belief. It's just something that I was taught. So anyway, I've been thinking a lot about this in the last couple weeks and months, talking to other people, and just wanted to throw out some ideas that I had on this topic about the difference between a teaching that's been inculcated into you, or a pattern of thinking, much like an operating system, And if you were to replace an operating system on your computer and to take out all those files associated with that operating system, that's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. It's not something that's just, 2 clicks of a mouse and you're through with that. And I think the same thing too, if you've been associated with an organization for years or decades, that to remove that pattern of thinking, to remove that operating system, I still keep finding little hidden files, using that metaphor, little things that are still hidden away in different corners of my mind that I still have to identify. I still have to pull it out and look at it and examine it and determine whether or not I actually believe it. So anyway, those were my thoughts for today. Thank you again for watching the channel and spending any time with me, and I look forward to hearing your comments or read the comments that you might post below. Thanks again.